don't know or you're not aware, the sort of intelligent design movement or field has changed drastically than what you might think. I mean, it used to be this, you think of like creation versus evolution, and I sort of brought that up before and how I sort of had issues with how Christians have dealt with that sort of discussion. Where that sort of ideas and the people who are leading that, it's sort of completely changed. It no longer addresses creation versus evolution, doesn't talk about evolution. It doesn't try to pit, creationism against evolution. I will write it down just in case you want to research it. But it's called the teleological movement or argument. And again, this is involved with what we've been talking about. It deals with more of the nature of the universe, qualities of the universe that sort of allow life to exist. Some might call it the fine-tuning argument. Dave sometimes talks about things about like the quality of water and why water does certain things, and it's unlike anything else in nature. So this doesn't necessarily deal with water, but it deals with like the constant of gravity, the mass of protons, the mass of neutrons, and all these things that seem like arbitrary qualities, but if they were any different, like life would be impossible. So again, if that's something that interests you, write that down, look it up, you read about it. I'm skipping over it because I think we've sort of dealt with that stuff enough. First drink of water. Mm-hmm. All right, so what we're going to start to get into is ethics and morality. So this is very different than what we've been talking about because I think that every single person here relates to this. I think every single person in the world sort of relates to morality in some sense. We're going to be talking about it in maybe very abstract ways and, learning these new words and these new terminologies to talk about it. And it might get very much abstract to you, but the minute you walk out of the door, you might actually have a moral question you have to deal with. Tommy, who's texting, might be telling his wife he wants to go to the movies later, and she's telling him he can't. And again, he has a moral problem he has to deal with.
That's actually exactly what I'm doing. It's like very strange.
Perfect. That was perfect, Tommy. Worked out better than I planned. So again, I think that this is something that's much more approachable because morality and ethics are something that is universally understood. Like everyone experiences it, everyone deals with it. I mean, if you have a Facebook and have way more friends on Facebook than you need, like me, you're constantly bombarded with different people's moral proclamations about some issue or another issue. Morality is everywhere. It's a life experience. You deal with it every day. My decision to go to work could even be a moral decision. It's like, I don't want to go to work, but it is good for me to go to work because I need to make money. It's good for my dad that I go to work. Helps his business. So again, I think like this is something that is easily relatable. So I'm going to quote someone because I like to quote people because people say things better than I do. Immanuel Kant, in his book Critique of Practical Reason, said, "Two things fill the mind with ever-increasing wonder and awe, the starry heavens above me and the moral law within me." Now, as eager as you might be to sort of maybe talk about this subject, I'm not really going to discuss, or I'm not here to talk about different moral causes. I'm not here to, talk about like what's the Christian view on such and such an issue. I love moral dilemmas. I love reading things that deal with moral questions. I love watching things that deal with moral questions. They're a ton of fun. At the end in the discussion time, you can ask me things I may or may not answer. We can have an open discussion about specific things, and it's a lot of fun. But what we're going to be dealing with is called metaethics. And Metaethics is basically like the nature of ethics as a whole. It's like, what is goodness, not what is good. Like, is goodness a thing? Is evil a thing? There's different types of ethics. There's applied, which is like, how do we actually put ethics into practice? There's normative ethics. This is how people should act. Like, how should we actually act? Descriptive ethics, like what you might think is right versus what I think is right. Things like that. But again, we're dealing in metaethics. So I wanted to sort of just give like just a brief introduction before we actually get into the argument. So Adam can put that up. I have handouts. I know people are eager, such as Tommy. He's very eager for his handout. If you don't have a folder, you can take one. Take a pen. I have a pen if you want to take notes. If you don't want one, don't take one. If you don't want to take notes, don't take notes. So again, this is called the moral argument. Actually, could I get one of those handouts, please? Thank you. What does it say? Can someone read it to me? All right, so I'm just going to read through the argument. Premise 1, if God does not exist, objective moral values and duties do not exist. Premise 2, objective moral values do exist, and the conclusion is, therefore, God exists. Very simple argument. Again, there's many different forms. As always, my forms come from William Craig. I think he puts them in the simplest form. Mark Linville and Paul Copan are two contemporary professors who deal heavily with this concept and this argument, and also Ravi Zacharias is someone who talks about this argument a lot. He deals a lot with this. So again, these are my sources. They do all the work, and I kind of just piggyback. Now, before I even sort of get into the premises of the argument, there's a common response to this that I'm going to deal with before I even start going through it premise by premise. And that you'll hear is that, how do I phrase it? It's that, like, are you saying as Christians, or is this argument saying that I need God to be a good person? Or do I need to believe in God to be a good person? And no, like, this argument is not saying that, nor do I believe that at all. Even in debates among academics and philosophers, this response comes up from professional, ethicists who may be from the atheistic side will have this sort of response. And again, if you have an understanding of the argument, the argument isn't really saying that, but also I want to sort of discuss, where does that response come from? And I think, like, if we're going to be honest with ourselves, we're part of the reason for that response. I think as Christians, we tend to use the moral stick. We tend to have that moral high ground where we look down on other people who may not be Christian. Dave talks a lot about, like, the judgment he's maybe received. I think everyone has probably been judged by someone else, and it doesn't feel good. Like, it doesn't feel good. And so, as a philosopher might criticize that response to this argument, where someone might say, like, I don't need God to be good. Like, I'm a good person. I don't need God. And I think they're right. Like people can understand goodness. People can be good people. They don't need to be Christians. And I think that the lesson from that response is that, don't use that. You don't need to tell people, like, that you're better than them because you're a Christian. To quote Ravi Zacharias, who says this a lot, he said that Jesus didn't come to make bad people good. He came to make dead people live. And I think that's very profound. And, if you think because you're a Christian, you're suddenly better than other people, like, it's not true. So again, I wanted to just get that right from the beginning. I wanted to address that issue. So yes, so again, that's being good without God. I think that the moral law is something that people recognize. We might not agree upon it. Everyone sort of has a different sense of it, but everyone sort of has their own sense of right and wrong. Everyone has their own sense of, oh, that's moral, that's immoral. You should do this, you should do that. So again, I'm repeating myself a lot, but I just want to keep putting that in your brain that, sorry, never mind. Understand that. It's been a couple weeks. All right, so before we sort of begin, I'm going to start on premise one, but we have to sort of define some things. And the first thing is we're going to define like objective. Like, what are objective moral values? What do I mean by objective? And what I mean is it's something that is true, like irregardless of what like people think, like what society might say, what someone's opinions are. So, oh, sorry, I thought you were raising your hand. So it's like my opinion of what like goodness is would be subjective. But what this premise is saying is that what we mean by objective is that something is like universally true. So, I mean, again, I said I wasn't going to get into specifics, but I want to sort of give some examples. You know, you might be able to argue against it, but so, for example, torturing a young child just to torture the child could be something that might be an example of something that is like objective, morally wrong. But another example is that, you know, a lot of philosophers like to use the Holocaust sort of is a good thing to use because it's sort of, people can sort of see like what they perceive to be the evil in the Holocaust. But what I mean is by objective is that, so we could say that the Axis powers won World War II and that they conquered the world. They succeeded in basically either getting rid of or brainwashing everyone to sort of believe what they believed. And that everyone in the world believed that like the eradication of the Jews, the gypsies, the homosexuals was right, like it was morally right. Objective in this sense means that that is still actually wrong. Like even if everyone believes that it's right, it still is objectively wrong. So again, that's what I mean by objective. Does anybody have any questions about objective in this sense? No? Yes. Oh wait, you need to use the microphone.
It's just so that people listening to this later will hear what you are saying.
I'm sure I want that. Too bad. So the objective part, if everybody believes that something, in your example there, if everybody is brainwashed or believes it, then who is deciding that it's objectively still wrong?
I mean, we'll get to that.
I'm jumping the gun.
Yeah, I mean, my question is more of like, just do you understand what I mean by objective?
I just wanted the mic.
Yeah, there you go. You can leave it on. You don't have to turn it off. I mean, you can ask the question. I'll repeat it.
Somebody else. Say, I'm Andrea.
Ben, as ridiculous as this sounds, if there is a place that feels like you could torture a child, you're saying that obviously that would still be objective, more moral, even if someone agrees with in other words, if that is acceptable somewhere.
Yeah.
Who sets that standard as objective?
What I'm saying is objective in this sense means that even if there's a society that agrees with torturing children, like it would still be wrong.
But who's saying it's wrong?
No one's like, I'm not saying who's saying it's wrong. I'm just defining what objective means, you know?
It's not subject to opinion.
Yeah, it's not subject to opinion. Like I said, I don't mean to get into specifics, but I had to get into specifics to make an example. I'm not trying to say like, oh, this is definitely objectively wrong. I'm just trying to use extreme examples to illustrate objective. Does that make sense?
So it's not just dictated by a majority?
That's what I mean by objective, yes. Okay. So now, the other thing we sort of have to define here is, you'll notice in the premise I talk about objective moral values and duties. So values are things that are good and bad, and duties are things that are right and wrong. Now that sort of might sound like it's the same, but what I mean by duties is moral obligation. It has to do with what you should do in a given situation. There's plenty of value, like things that are good, but it doesn't mean you have to do them. You don't have a moral duty. It would be good if I became a doctor and like save lives, but I don't have a moral duty to become a doctor. And also you can have moral duties can come up in situations where there is nothing that has a morally good value choice. What they say, like the lesser of two evils. You might remember that movie, Sophie's Choice, where a woman in a concentration camp had to choose between her two children. Like, choose one to die or else they both die. So again, there's no good in that situation, but there still is a moral duty in that situation. So that's the difference between moral values and duties, and that's why I want to talk about why both are in the argument. So anybody have any questions about moral values, moral duties, the difference? Need some more examples? Anybody have an example? Hand the microphone back.
The example you gave of Sophie's Choice, so what she was doing was the moral duty?
That was a duty. She was engaging in a moral duty.
Okay.
Saying like the moral value of that, like her children dying are both bad. Those are both bad things. So again, but there's still like a good and bad thing in terms of duty. Like she has to still make a choice, and one of those choices will be better than the other.
And that's the duty.
That's
to
the
make
duty.
The choice, right?
That's the difference between value and duty. Value has to do with things. Duties more have to do with choices and action. That's our personal. Think of moral obligation as is what duty is.
I hope I'm not repeating what we've all been talking about. And you would know who said this. Nothing is right nor wrong, but that thinking makes it so.
I actually don't know who said that.
It was a philosopher, apparently.
It sounds familiar.
Which means to me, each individual in the world gets to decide what is wrong and what is right. So to take the example of, say, Adolf Hitler, he obviously thought he was right, and he convinced 80 million Germans to go along with that, although I think they were forced to. So I guess my question is, in the universe, with or without a God, is the individual able to decide a moral right and a moral wrong?
I mean, your question has a lot in there. I mean, I think the first part of your question, read premise one. I mean, basically the second half of premise one says objective moral values and duties do not exist. So premise one is sort of agreeing with that. Each person sort of chooses what they want, what they don't want. Many parts of your question are going to come up as we go. As I said, I'm trying to just explain the difference between values and duties. And I don't mean to sort of skirt it, but I'm going to get there. We're going to talk about that. Again, this is a topic that I was sort of very excited about, but like sort of dreading. I think we're going to spend a lot of time on this one because there's so many types of questions like that can come up, and it's very easy to sort of go off tangents, get muddied, and I just want to be clear, but like everyone understands the difference between objective and subjective and values and duties. That's sort of where we're going with this. So again, any questions about those things, the difference between those things? I think everybody understands that. All right, so now we're going to actually check the time. All right, we are just going to focus on premise 1 tonight. We're going to focus on that. What Bill, is that your name? Bill, yeah, what Bill said, and sort of what the thing about people choose what's good, people choose what's bad, like, so Hitler sort of chose what he thought was good, and some people thought that was bad, but it's sort of each person sort of develops their own moral reasoning through maybe experience, through life. And again, all that is sort of, premise 1 affirms that. Again, read the premise. Objective moral values do not exist. This is just saying if God does not exist, objective moral values do not exist. What this is, though, it's moral relativism. That's what premise 1 is. Premise 1 standalone could be an argument for moral relativism. I find that, I agree with premise 1 that, like, if God doesn't exist, I don't think objective moral values exist. I'm not saying everyone agrees with premise 1, which we'll get to. I was gonna kind of just, what's that? Patty was asking me if it wasn't true, there would be no argument.
Like if God does not exist, if God didn't exist, like there would be no argument of back and forth. There wouldn't be what? There wouldn't be any.
Yes. So, yeah, you're just reaffirming what I'm saying. Pass the microphone to Tommy. You might want to text your wife and ask her it's okay if you can talk.
I tell you, whoa. When I walked in, Ben said, I'm going to pick on you, so he's let me have it.
It's because he's a good sport.
I am a good sport. So let me ask you this then. It says, if God does not exist, objective moral values and duties do not exist. But I've actually heard some people say they don't believe in God, but they do believe
Yes.
that there are objective eternally existing moral values.
Yes.
So I guess I'm wondering if you could dive into the opposite of premise 1, the argument against premise 1 a little bit more for me, so I can better understand what they're saying.
Okay, but you're going to have to wait.
Oh, okay.
We're going to get into objections to premise 1. So let me just sort of like dive right in here. So in a lot of the classes, I've just kind of been talking about atheism. We've been talking about these arguments and how atheists respond. I haven't been very broad I've been very broad in my description of atheism, but this argument is sort of the first argument where I need to sort of differentiate different types of atheism. The one I've sort of mostly been talking about is what I would call naturalism. Naturalism is the view that there clearly is no God. Everything that exists is just the natural world. All we need are sort of all the different sciences, and that like our entire universe can be understood someday just by all the natural sciences. Human beings under this view are just the product of matter, time, chance, and then combined together using the process of evolution, both physical evolution and what is called societal evolution. Societies evolve. And so there are other types of atheism that will disagree with premise 1. However, I think that naturalism is the type of atheism that would affirm premise 1. I think that they agree with this. They would say that, yes, we clearly do not have objective moral values, that moral values have evolved. It's been this societal functional thing that it's been better for the society as a whole that we do certain things as opposed to other certain things to help society grow. Sort of the you scratch my back, I scratch your back. There is no transcendental sort of anchor for morality, you know, and it's something that's revealed in nature. You know, baboons show altruistic behavior because it helps like the group, it helps the tribe, and that we were once just like baboons, and that behavior has just sort of progressed to where we are now. But it doesn't go any further than that. Like there's nothing, they would say, like under naturalism, there's nothing that makes human beings any more special that gives us a right to sort of create this moral law, this like objective overreaching moral law. Like what makes it that could be morally binding. It's just a functional thing that helps society, and has helped the human race become the top of like basically the earth. And I mean, and I would sort of agree with that under naturalism. I would agree that there is no God. Then you can say that that view is just because look at where humans are. I mean, there's 7 billion of us. There isn't really any other species that sort of challenges us. So our systems of both morality, law, society have clearly been the better compared to other species. So again, we are just products of biological social evolution, and the values that we embrace are just the like sociobiologically relative products of this system of evolution, just our DNA sort of creating better systems for survival, better systems to promote itself in terms of DNA. So again, the atheist from the naturalist perspective, I think, would agree with premise one. I think the theist agrees with premise one. I agree with premise one as a theist. I think, you know, as Patty said, she definitely agrees with sort of premise one. You know, like clearly if God does not exist, then there really is there is no basis for us to have sort of an objective moral law. You know, it becomes just, you know, do what works best, do what best promotes society. Sorry, this is Adam. I mean, Tommy. I was gonna say, Tommy, it's your fault. So. Microphone. Oh, yes, I'm an externalizer. No, I'm just nervous. That's my mouth dries out. I did, you know, because he stares at me. Adam, he's yeah, but Adam just draws my gaze. So again, and so to back up sort of like to back up my claim that this like naturalists would agree with this, I have some quotes from some of them. Bertrand Russell, who I've talked about before in this class, you may remember. He's the late Bertrand Russell. He was, you know, mid-20th century. He's actually one of the greater atheistic and agnostic thinkers. He said that, and I quote, "Ethics arises from the pressure of the community on the individual. Man does not always instinctively feel the desires which are useful to his herd. The herd, being anxious that the individual should act in its own interest, has invented various devices for causing the individual's interests to be in harmony with that of the herd. One of these devices is morality, alongside government, law, customs, family," end quote. So Russell describes morality as a herd morality, what I sort of said before about the baboons, sort of evolved in us to help the herd of Homo sapien, sort of helped us progress. You don't kill, you don't steal because you don't want the same thing done to you. So it's a mutually beneficial thing. Richard Dawkins, who is contemporary right now, he's an evolutionary biologist, also an atheist. He wrote the book, The God Delusion. "There is at bottom no design, no purpose, no evil, no good, nothing but pointless indifference. We are machines for propagating DNA. It is every living object's sole reason for being. And again, a naturalist view. And so, sort of in response to Richard Dawkins, not so much as an objection, but I would bring up someone like Genghis Khan. I think in Richard Dawkins' view would be sort of a great example of Homo sapien. He had, I think, over 100 children, maybe thousands of grandchildren, acquired probably billions of dollars in wealth, brought together many people, so unified the tribe. And under this view, I mean, he's someone to look up to, I think. Now we look back on him under our moral view and think that he was a monster. But again, that is sort of under this view that's just, we have our own societal function of morality looking back at the morality of that day, and you can't really compare the two, no one can say that what he was doing is worse because he wasn't around today, he was around then. Michael Ruse, who is a philosopher of biology, he wrote that morality is a biological adaptation, no less than our hands and feet and teeth, considered as a rationally justifiable set of claims about an objective something. Ethics are illusory. I appreciate that when someone says, love thy neighbor as thyself, they think they're referring above and beyond themselves. Nevertheless, such reference is truly without foundation. Morality is just an aid to survival and reproduction. Any deeper meaning is illusory. So, Michael Ruse also likes to make us think that, imagine we rewind the evolutionary clock and there was some different set of values that sort of helped us as evolve to the top of the but helped us evolve this to the top of the species ladder. And he said that today, if that was the case, we might think that would be a morally good thing. We could imagine that, and it's something you see in the animal world, that forcible copulation, or as we call it, rape, could be something that could not be wrong. Actually, I mean, to bring this up, I mean, in parts of the world, there are cultures that isn't wrong. And again, if it helps to propagate your DNA, if it helps to spread the species, is it necessarily a bad thing under this view? In fact, you can even look at birth rates. Birth rates in cultures where this isn't really frowned upon are much higher than our birth rates. So, eventually they might just breed us out. And you probably all know about Friedrich Nietzsche. He was a 19th century atheist. This isn't really a quote, but he sort of declared that God is dead. He used this view to develop what he called nihilism or nihilism, coming from the Latin word nihil, which means nothing. Nihilism is the view that life is without value or meaning. There is nothing. We are just, as Richard Dawkins would say, machines for propagating DNA. So again, there are some naturalists that agree with this premise, I would think. As I said, as a theist, I agree with this premise. I think I might have skipped something. But again, so I mean, I think this is pretty clear, but like I said, just imagine that, God does not exist and that there is no real purpose other than sort of propagating our DNA, surviving as a species. Under this view that this premise seems to be very plausible. And again, remember back earlier when I was describing arguments, we want the premises to be more plausibly true than their negations. So I think this one's pretty clear in that sense, from that perspective. Now, does anybody have any questions sort of from the naturalist perspective or question?
Ben, this theory and these premises, how much of it exploded after Darwin? I mean, did it really start to take fruit and develop pre-Darwin, or more so after his whole theory on evolution?
I'm not sure exactly. I know like Nietzsche had a big influence on sort of the modern thinkers. I think sort of before generally just the Enlightenment period or after that it wasn't so much of a non-belief in God. It was more about different versions of God arguing against each other. You know, if you go back to like early Christian philosophers, Aquinas, he was more arguing against other views of God, whether it be like the Greeks and their pantheism. You know, there was when Islam first sort of came onto the scene, there were Christian thinkers at the time who actually, Islam was sort of an offshoot of, they considered an offshoot of Christianity, and they considered it like a heresy, almost like a cult. And they were trying to argue against Islam at the time as that arose. So again, I don't really, in terms of your question, I don't really think there was so much of discussion between like, does God exist, does God not exist, until probably the last couple hundred years.
So again, in the Middle Ages, these theories wouldn't have been bandied about.
So his question was, so in the Middle Ages, these theories wouldn't really have been discussed. This one, no. The other ones I spoke about, the previous classes, the sort of the causal argument, the explanatory argument, those ones go back almost to like just to around the life of Christ. Because remember, even into the Middle Ages, the last argument I talked about, the Islamic philosopher Al-Ghazali, I mean, that was the 12th century. Again, the moral argument is much more current. The moral discussion is much more current. Especially advances in neuroscience have strengthened sort of the opposing view to this. Like I said, evolutionary biology, evolutionary ethics. So again, this is a much more current thing we're discussing.
So if a naturalist, how do they explain the rise of somebody who wants to literally kill millions of DNA providers?
I mean, I think that someone maybe like Dawkins would say that, you know, that is, he's basically going against like what sort of evolution, the evolutionary urge, he's going against it.
So he would be objectively immoral.
Yes, ultimately that sort of goes to sort of the response you have to sort of people like these things. That sort of some of my personal issues with it is that when you get down to it and they start describing evolution, it's almost like evolution itself starts to have a will. Like evolution desires certain things over other, like what makes the propagation of our DNA, like why is that? Why should that be something that is strived for? Why does evolution want our DNA to go forward? Like, I'm not saying evolution wants, but when they start talking about it and defending sort of these questions, they sort of give this will to evolution. And again, I'm strictly talking about naturalists. There are humanists, there are realists, and I'm not discuss them today. They're, like I said. I just don't like, when it comes to this argument and this issue, there are different ways of thinking that are atheistic, that aren't just naturalism. Previously, I've just been basically talking about naturalism, but I want to really be fair to how I present the views. So, as I said, today I just sort of want to talk about naturalism. Like I said, we're going to...
So with
Yes.
So, with that argument, isn't sometimes, take the animal kingdom, they kill off the weak to make the species itself stronger. So, theoretically, couldn't we just say, we're going to kill off this group of people because it's going to make our society a little, like, the humans in general will make it stronger. If we get rid of a certain group of people because they have diseases, we're making humanity itself stronger.
Yes. And that's sort of my objection. You're sort of hinting at my objections to naturalists. I mean, so he didn't have his mic, so what he sort of talked about is that if the goal of naturalism is sort of to propagate the species, and in nature we see like either the abandoning of the weak in a species or sometimes the killing of the weak. You can see in packs, the weakest member of the pack sometimes gets killed off to make the whole pack stronger. And so why then not should we just sort of just get rid of, let's say, the terminally ill or like the disabled? And again, this is sort of going back to the Holocaust. I think this was like Hitler's view. There was a TV show, I'm going to bring up TV now, that because I'm going back to this now, that was on Amazon. It was called Man in the High Castle. I mean, the show is interesting, but basically what the show is, it's like a fictional history that imagines that the Axis power won World War II. And basically, the United States was half ruled by Japan and half ruled by Nazi Germany. And it's sort of the most powerful sort of scene in the whole show to me was one of the main characters is sort of driving through the country and he blows out his tire and a cop pulls by and he's like, the cop gets out of the car and the cop has, Nazi, his police uniform is, full of Nazi insignia, but he's an American. And they sort of have this jovial conversation. Oh, you had a blowout. Oh, let me help you out. Where you headed? All this stuff. And then it sort of appears to start snowing. And the guy is like, what's this, snow? And the cop sort of like very flippantly said, he's like, oh, it's Tuesday. He's like, oh, the hospital's burning all the cripples and terminally ill. And it's like, I thought it was like, it's so powerful, that scene. But again, I think that scene illustrates what a world like that would be. Like it's hard for me to sort of think how like that is, again, sorry, it's hard for me to picture how that is actually like the truth of life. Like my personal experience, like I don't ever see like any way that could just be okay. And again, the argument would be, well, you've evolved that way. But again, with what Doug said, but yet they're helping the species as a whole. And so this is where I sort of attack naturalism on, is that, we have these things in human nature, these like supererogatory acts, they're called, these completely selfless acts, not even to help sort of someone that's stronger than us, but to help sort of the weak. I mean, as a society, we look out for the minorities, we look out for the poor, we look out for children who may be sick, we like take care of the terminally ill. And again, I find that you can see it right in things that like I read, things that Dawkins said. It's very hard to sort of justify why we are like that under sort of an evolutionary framework. So again, then if it doesn't seem like naturalism is the logical way, so what are some of the other things we can talk about? So I'm going to sort of change it up a little bit, but next week, Tommy, we're going to talk about humanism. We're going to talk about moral realism, it's called, and how they would deal. They are the ones who disagree with premise one. But it's interesting to know that as a theist, you and naturalists both think premise one is true. So there, get arm in arm with your naturalist buddies, and you guys can both say, yeah, premise one is true. Like, if God does not exist, objective moral values and duties do not exist. Okay, so real quick, this has to do with this argument, but I want to sort of, it's kind of a fun thing to do, think about. I did say no moral dilemmas, but I'm going to present one. Well, it's not really a moral dilemma. One response to this argument as a whole, so actually I misspoke when I was speaking to my dad when I said, does this argument recent or not? If you go back to the time of Socrates and Plato, they dealt with ethics and morality quite a bit. So in Plato's dialogues, there was this character called Euthyphro. If you've never read Plato, he would create these conversations between fictional characters, and they would be having a discussion, and that's sort of how he wrote out his views. So Euthyphro was one of the characters. Let me spell it out for you. I think Dave likes that way of... So this is Euthyphro's... Oops, I spelled dilemma wrong. Euthyphro's dilemma. So Euthyphro's dilemma is, he asks the question of the other character, is something good because God wills it? Or does God will it because it's good? Does anybody want to sort of tackle that?
No.
No thoughts? I'll write it out just so you can read it again. Is something good because God wills it, or, does God will it because it is good? So I'll explain why this seems like a dilemma. So the first part of the dilemma is something good because God wills it. Then goodness sort of becomes arbitrary. God could sort of decide whatever he wants to be good. And because he's God, and because he says it's good, then therefore it's good. So what if God said, like, murdering babies is good? Then, God said it, so it's good. So again, then the first part of the statement, morality, becomes arbitrary. Second part of the statement is, or does God do something because it is good? Now, the problem with this part is that would mean that God is then subject to something above him. Like there is some sort of goodness that then God, just like us, must sort of engage with. He must do things because they're good. So again, that's, if you know, a dilemma is when you have sort of two options and neither one of them are good. You know, they, like I say, the two horns of a dilemma. So if you didn't know what a dilemma was, does that sort of answer your question? Like not understanding what it was?
Are you describing parenting?
I wouldn't know. I don't have any kids. So, all right, there's two ways to sort of get out of a dilemma. One is you disprove one of the statements. The other way is you present another option, because dilemma is only two options. So I think, and like I said, this is something that has been written about for a very long time, how to deal with this dilemma. And the third option would be that, I don't know how to say it now because I didn't write it down. No, but yes. God does the good because God is good.
He is good, and it's up to us to come into agreement.
And so it becomes part of God's nature. Like in the nature of God, God's nature is good. He is good. He's not subject to the good. He doesn't choose the good. It's just that he is good. And that, a little bit of Christian doctrine there. You know, I try to avoid that a little bit. But I thought I was going to say something else about this, but... Oh, yes, I was. I just remembered. So this was actually, I put this up for Linda. Because Linda early on in the class sort of asked me sort of indignantly, like, what's the point of all this? She's like, she's like, you're basically, she's like telling me that I believe the same stuff as like a Muslim, as like, like Orthodox Jewish people. She's like, I'm a Christian. Like, how is that? How is this? Like, this doesn't give me any differences between them. Now, in Islam, this is their doctrine. They believe that something is good because God wills it, and that God can change what is good. God can change his mind. They believe that the ultimate sovereignty of God. Hear about their, if you sacrifice your life in jihad, you'll go to paradise and get, the number of virgins. But they also say that it's not absolute. There's no absolute guarantee under their doctrine, because God can just choose to not give you that under like the Islamic doctrine. That you can follow all the laws of Islam, but yet you still have no guarantee, because God can still decide to not give you those promises. So that was for Linda. She asked me some of the what will these arguments do to differentiate her Christianity with Islam. So that's why I wanted to bring that up. So again, that's sort of it for today. I know there's tons of stuff we didn't get to, but this is a big topic. We'll probably be on this for probably 3 to 4 to 5 weeks. So hopefully it's a little more. Johnny, you have a question? Hopefully this is a little more engaging than, actual infinites versus potential infinites. I know that's Tommy's favorite. Any final questions or comments? Has the mic back.
I want to ask you a technical question. And the first premise is like a double negative. Can you change that to a double positive and still everything follow through?
Were you here the sort of first class where I talked about
I'm afraid to say yes.
logical
But I was.
So I talked about logical equivalency. I don't need to write it down, but yeah, you could say, if God exists, objective moral values and duties do exist, and it's the exact same meaning. They're logically equivalent statements. When you negate both parts, it means it's the same thing. The reason it's worded this way is because then you initially sort of get objections right out of the way in the argument. This is because if God exists, ultimately you'd say, well, this argument is for God existence, so then why is God's existence in the first premise? So we're saying, like, if God does not exist, these things do not exist.
So phrasing it like that eliminates that.
Sort of, like I said, it sort of gets to the heart of the discussion quicker. It's bypassing some objections right away. But it means the same thing. It's a logical equivalent statement.
So based on what we learned tonight, if you did not establish to us yet that God actually is the reason for our moral
No.
compass, right?
Nope.
No. You just explained to us that there are naturalists who, some of them agree with this.
Yeah, I would say premise one, I'm sort of giving you the plausibility of premise one, the truth, in that there are even groups of atheists who agree with premise one. Mm-hmm. As I said, as a theist, I think premise one is obvious for us, but there's also groups of atheists who also agree with premise one.
One of which are the naturalists that
Yes.
we talked about. Okay.
Yeah, very good. All right, so I think that's going to be it. And see you in 2 weeks.